Imagine, just for a second, being told you have only months to live. Seriously, what do you do? Do you surrender? Do you resign yourself to a hospital bed? Or do you look out at the horizon and decide right then and there to conquer the most dangerous, unforgiving oceans on Earth? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're looking at one of the most astonishing stories of human endurance ever recorded, the Lonely Sea, Chichester's brutal masterpiece aboard Gipsy Moth III and IV. And let me tell you, this isn't just a story about sailing. It's a literal life-or-death battle against the elements and, honestly, against one's own physical limits.
Okay, let's dive into this. The setting is the late 1950s. Francis Chichester was already this renowned aviation pioneer, a guy who routinely laughed in the face of superstitions. But then, he gets handed an absolute death sentence, a diagnosis of advanced lung cancer, and doctors are giving him mere months to live. But Chichester? He was just wired differently than the rest of us. He flat out refused to waste away in a hospital ward. Instead, he turned his eyes away from the sky and looked straight toward the brutal, lonely expanse of the sea.
So that brings us to Section 1, the Ocean Cure. This covers his time starting with Gipsy Moth III, around 1960.
And it all really kicks off with this number right here, 58. That was Chester's age when, after experiencing what really can only be described as a miraculous recovery from that terminal diagnosis, he decided to do the unthinkable. At 58 years old, he didn't just go for some leisurely weekend sail. No, he entered the first ever single-handed transatlantic race, the O-Star, in 1960. He was stepping right into the ultimate arena of isolation.
Now, the vessel that carried in was Gipsy Moth III, which was a 39-foot Robert Clark-designed cutter. And unlike the super fragile airplanes from his youth, she was sturdy, she was reliable and very sea-kindly. Chichester sailed her completely alone all the way from Plymouth, England to New York. I mean, he was the captain, the navigator, and the entire crew rolled into one. Relying on flawless passage planning and absolute expertise in celestial navigation, he crossed the notoriously treacherous North Atlantic. And he didn't just survive the crossing, guys. He won the race in 40 days, setting a brand new world record.
But if you think 40 days was enough to satisfy a guy like this, take a look at this next number, 33. Because for Chichester, 40 days was just too slow. 2 years later, in 1962, he took Gipsy Moth III right back out across the freezing gales of the Atlantic. He fought through absolutely brutal conditions to smash his own record, finishing that treacherous voyage in just 33 days.
Which leads us to Section 2, Birth of a Monster. We're looking at his new yacht for 1965.
So, after racing Gipsy Moth III one last time in 1964 and taking second place, Chichester had this profound realization. If he wanted to truly conquer the globe on the brutal old clipper routes, he needed a radically different, much faster machine. But just contrast his trusted Gipsy Moth III, sturdy, reliable, sea-kindly with that nice stiff flotation, with what he commissioned next, Gipsy Moth IV. She was a massive 54-foot ketch, designed purely, unashamedly for speed. But there was a terrifying problem. She was an absolute beast to handle. She was notoriously cranky, suffering from terrifying stability issues, and her riding moment was super sluggish. Chichester was no longer sailing with a partner, he was literally fighting a monster.
In fact, listen to this. He later wrote bitterly that she, quote, rolled wildly in following seas, demanding sheer physical agony from a 65-year-old man just to keep her on course. You can just feel the tension in those words, right? Gipsy Moth IV wasn't just a boat to him, she was an adversary. Every single mile was a physical brawl between a senior citizen and this 54-foot cranky yacht.
Moving on to Section 3, Global Conveyor Belt. Let's talk about the circumnavigation itself.
All right, so it's August 1966, and Chichester is departing Plymouth with this truly audacious goal, to circumnavigate the globe with only one stop. As he heads south, he catches the favorable trade winds, pushes through the suffocating doldrums, and swings right around the Cape of Good Hope. But then, he enters the terrifying domain of the Southern Ocean. This place is essentially a global conveyor belt of destruction. Riding the massive swells of the Antarctic circumpolar current, Chichester found himself literally surfing Gipsy Moth IV down waves the size of actual apartment buildings. Just imagine that for a second. Surviving on maybe a few hours of sleep, constantly wrestling with a yacht that desperately wants to roll over, completely surrounded by freezing skyscraper-sized waves.
It took a grueling, mind-bending 107 days at sea before he finally managed to pull into Sydney, Australia.
And both he and the boat were battered, but unbroken. Now think about what you or I would do in this situation. Most of us would kiss the dock, thank our lucky stars, and book a first-class flight home, right?
or at least enjoy a quiet retirement. But no, not this guy. This 65-year-old man who apparently preferred wrestling a waterlogged beast over resting in a hospital bed spent his time in Sydney reinforcing the hull, tweaking the rigging, and actively preparing himself for the ultimate maritime nightmare.
And that nightmare brings us to Section 4, the graveyard of ships, the Pacific and Cape Horn. And this brilliantly illustrates just how perilous it got. Leaving Sydney, Chichester plunged straight back into the desolate stretches of the Pacific known as the Roaring Forties and the Furious 50s. And the terror out there is absolute. First, a rogue wave just violently catches the yacht. Next, Gipsy Moth IV suffers a catastrophic 60-degree roll. Instantly, the inside of the cabin becomes a literal washing machine of flying gear, freezing water, and shattered glass, with Chichester caught right in the middle of the chaos. Finally, thanks only to her heavy keel, the severely damaged ship painfully rights herself. He survived, but man, the damage was profound.
But there was no turning back now. He was approaching Cape Horn, which is widely considered the Mount Everest of sailing. And how did he navigate this beast? He relied purely on a sextant and a chronometer. No GPS, no digital maps. Battered by sleet and screaming hurricane-force winds, Chichester perfectly plotted his course and successfully rounded the Horn, surviving the single most dangerous shipping choke point on planet Earth.
Which brings us to this incredibly triumphant number, 226. In May 1967, after 226 exhausting days at sea, having covered an unfathomable 29,600 miles, Francis Chichester finally sailed back into Plymouth.
The contrast here just speaks for itself. A decade earlier, this man was lying in a hospital bed, told he'd be dead in months. Now, to put that into perspective, 250,000 people are lining the shores to welcome him home. The man who refused to die had just single-handedly conquered the oceans, and for his unmatched bravery and skill, he was knighted, Sir Francis Chichester.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this all builds, because looking back at its evolution, the transformation is just staggering. In 1960, he wins the inaugural O-Star on the reliable Gipsy Moth IV. By 1962, he goes right back out and shaves a week off his own record. Then, August 1966, he departs on the notoriously unstable Gipsy Moth IV. By December, he miraculously survives the Southern Ocean to reach Sydney. And finally, in May 1967, he rounds Cape Horn and secures his status as a global maritime legend. It is a timeline of absolute, unyielding defiance.
So what does this all mean for us? I want to leave you with a final thought, really the ultimate takeaway from Chichester's brutal masterpiece. If a dying, 65-year-old man can battle a cranky yacht through apartment-sized waves, survive a 60-degree knockdown, and conquer the world's deadliest oceans entirely alone, what self-imposed limits are you ready to shatter? Seriously, let that sink in. Thanks for joining me on this explainer today, and I genuinely hope this sparks the courage for you to tackle your own oceans, whatever they may be.